Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. Welcome to Celebrating the Evolution and Future of Collective Impact. I am thrilled to be welcoming Jennifer Splansky and Junious Williams to join me in this conversation and to join all of you. So there will be lots of time at the end for your questions and dialogue. So throughout, feel free to kind of pop them into the chat box, but also write them down and be thinking about them as we go along. And I think I turn it to you now. Do I, Connor?
Thanks, Sylvia. So I'd like to start off this webinar with a land acknowledgement. So we begin this webinar by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. For those of us who are settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all of the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. This recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm joining from Takaranto, colonially known as Toronto. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people. By acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I'm trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, and political contexts embedded within the lands known as Canada, as well as commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land. So please, in the chat box, share with us, what lands are you joining from this afternoon? And then before I pass it to Sylvia, I just want to quickly kind of give everyone an idea of who's in the room. So locally, we almost had every province and territory within Canada. We are just missing none of it, but we have people joining us from the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Quebec, Newfoundland. Internationally, we had almost half of the states represented in the United States. We have 25 states joining us today, such as Illinois, Florida, Colorado, Massachusetts, and even across the pond and globally, we have people from England, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. So thank you once again for joining us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are in the world. We really appreciate you spending this afternoon with us, or this time with us. And Sylvia, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Connor. Welcome, everybody. It's so lovely that we have such an international audience. And so let's dive right in. I'd like to introduce you to the two guests we're hosting today on our webinar. First, I'd like to introduce you to Junious Williams. Junious is a senior advisor with the Collective Impact Forum and the principal of Junious Williams Consulting, a firm that specializes in research, policy analysis, collaboration, facilitation, program development, and assessment focused on increasing equity and social justice. He brings to this work more than 25 years on a variety of multi-sector collaborations and collective impact initiatives that have focused on a range of issues, including cradle-to-career pathways, youth education and employment, improving outcomes for boys and men of color. He's also done quite a bit of community building work and led several initiatives across a range of issues, including the successful negotiation of a landmark community benefits agreement for a major development projects in Oakland and San Francisco. Junious holds a Juris Doctorate in law and a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Michigan, where he also pursued graduate studies in education administration. Welcome, Junious. And also joining us this afternoon, Jennifer Splansky. Jennifer is the executive director of the Field Building Initiative, the Collective Impact Forum. She leads FSG San Francisco office and is one of FSG leaders in collective impact field building. She's worked on a number of collective impact engagements, designed training opportunities for thousands of collective impact practitioners as well. She is also a co-author of multiple publications on collective impact. And she brings to this work experience with a range of foundations, nonprofits, government agencies, and corporations across sectors on issues of strategy, evaluation, and program design. Jen is a graduate of Stanford University and Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. She lives in Berkeley, California with her husband and two daughters. I'm so glad to have you both with us today. And would love to dive right in to our conversation and our questions, if you'd like. So One of the things that I've been really excited about, and the focus certainly for this webinar, is marking the 10-year anniversary of Collective Impact. And part of what I particularly loved is the new series that's now being published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and loved in particular the wisdom brought together by so many different practitioners profiling real world examples. It's one thing to understand the framework. I think what's really exciting 10 years later is to look back and see the creativity and innovation that so many collective impact practitioners have brought to taking this work and making it real and live in their places and on the issues that are nearest and dearest to their heart. One of the things, though, that for me was the most significant was the article that you two co-authored alongside others about centering equity in collective impact. And one of the things in particular that I found lovely was this reframed, upgraded definition of the importance of centering work of collective impact in a way that explicitly identifies equity as the North Star of all collective impact work. Can you say, so I'm opening this up and asking if you could tell us a little bit more for those who may not have seen this new definition, but also the story behind how you landed there and why.
Sure. Thank you, Sylvia. It's so nice to be with everyone on the line, some familiar faces and lots of new folks. Thank you so much for joining. So the evolution to put collective impact to have equity right at the center isn't something that just started with this article, but it's something that the Collective Impact Forum and our advisors and our colleagues have really been working on for many years. And as you mentioned, this article and a formal new definition were published about 10 years after the original Collective Impact article. And when we realized that we were coming up on that 10-year anniversary, it was almost like a good forcing function to say, we've been doing this work to elevate the importance of equity and collective impact work and begin to support folks in how to do it. But let's make this a bit more official. And for us, what that meant was certainly codifying all of the learning Junious and many colleagues have been bringing into the work, and doing so in the same publication where the original article was published, which is the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And that original article has been downloaded over 1 million times, according to SSIR, which is hard to get your mind around. And so we felt that having updated definition and essentially, and the key part of putting equity at the center needed to live there next to the original frame. We'll share a little bit more about the definition in a minute, but that was a bit of the motivation of writing this article and submitting it into that journal in particular, because equity has to be at the core of this work. And the original framework was neutral, as you said, Sylvia, and we don't want folks to be under the impression that this work can achieve the gains that it needs to for those who have been most oppressed and most marginalized in our communities without putting equity at the center. I'm going to hand it to Junious for that new definition in a minute, but I just want to also recognize that while it is 10 years since the publication of the original article, this work of place-based, cross-sector, community-centered collaboration is centuries, decades, and certainly decades, and likely also centuries in the making. And so, yes, the article collective impact and that term were coined about 10 years ago. It is building on the experience and wisdom of generations, including in many Canadian communities. And so this builds on that. The collective impact frame is a codification of some practices, but it is certainly not 10 years since that work has started. But let me hand it to Junious to take us through some of the new definitions.
Yes, thank you, Jen. And I also want to thank Sylvia and Connor for inviting and helping to coordinate the session today. What I'd like to do is to maybe just jump right into a couple of definitional points. And I think these are especially important as Sylvia indicated, that we've kind of reformulated the basic concept and framework of collective impact. And in addition to that, we spent some time, since we were going to be trying to recenter the collective impact work on equity, that it was important to define equity as well. So want to jump into the definition here. And just really quickly, there are elements of this that are highlighted in bold that I really think do kind of give an emphasis to what we think are important. That all of this work, the equity work, the collective impact, all of the social change work, we think really needs to be about fairness and justice. That's the foundation, and no matter what the specific issue is, it tends to be a reflection of our inability to have achieved fairness and justice for various groups. So that forms the kind of foundation that this work needs to be about fairness and justice. It's also, given our past practices of discrimination, and I'll speak specifically to the American context, which I'm most familiar with, you've got to, given our patterns of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual preference, orientation, you go down the list, and we've messed up culturally in America around othering those people and tending to build systems that treat them differently. So an important part of this is systematically assessing where are the disparities, which populations have been marginalized and aren't reaping the full measure and share of the opportunities, outcomes, and representation, which is the next element. Those are our standards. And I want to do something. For a long time, we focused on opportunity in America. You'll note that this definition includes two other things. Representation is important for kids, for adults, for anybody to be able to see themselves in the civic life of their nation and their community is an important motivation factor. So representation isn't a throwaway. Representation is an invitation to people to come into the circle and to try to make change. And in the absence of that, you're telling people you ain't invited to this. So the outcomes and opportunities, and I'll just speak for myself, I'm an outcome person at this point in my life and my career. America had more than enough opportunity to get opportunity right, and we fail consistently. And we have so polluted the landscape where the only true measure for me is outcomes at this point. It's not about opportunity. We figured out how to manipulate the opportunity assessment to think everything's all right when in fact it's not, and we're not producing outcomes. And then finally, you've got to not only identify who's experiencing disparities, but you've got to take action effectively to address those. And we're talking about targeted action. If Latinos are experiencing disproportionate levels of suspension or failure to be able to achieve grade level reading or whatever the issue is, you can't go to a universal solution, a universal strategy or tactic to address that. You have to stay focused on that population that experienced that disparity. You've got to engage with people from that community and understanding the data and interpreting the data, understanding the historical and contemporary context of what's happening to them in order to get the sorts of strategies and interventions that are going to be effective. So it's targeting. So that's the definitional piece. A lot embedded in that, but it's reflecting sort of an approach and almost an underlying belief system that people, if you're going to be serious about addressing equity, that you have to manifest. Really quickly, and I'm not going to spend as much, but next slide. The other thing is we've reformulated. Here's a traditional or original definition of collective impact. And I'm going to go through the next slide, please. And here's the new one. I prefer, though, the next slide so that you can see the comparison in starker. The first original definition, it doesn't mention equity. It emphasizes sectors of the economy as opposed to the new definition, which emphasizes community members, organizations, and institutions, the people and the actors who are much more representative of the stakeholder groups within our communities. And while having people from various sectors who represent power and influence in the economy is important, it is not sufficient if you don't have the institutional players, the community folks, the people with lived experience. So that's a big part of this. The second thing is, in the original definition, there was a focus on the elements of the collective impact. And in the new definition, we focused really on what we want, whoever's at the table, what we want the behaviors to be of those people. How are they working together? And we emphasized in a way that the original definition and framework didn't. This is about learning together. It's about us getting together and aligning what the hell we're doing around these problems and integrating our action, more collective and less of the independent stuff that has too long characterized social change movements. The original definition focused on population level change. We remain committed to that. It ain't sufficient if 20,000 kids need a treatment or intervention that we're doing 25 or 50. We ain't never going to reach critical mass and eliminate problems if we're not doing them at scale. So we maintain that. But what we added explicitly in the definition is that this is about systems change, that what's producing a lot of the bad outcomes is what we've embedded into the structure and systems that are operating almost on automatic pilot. And we know that because sometimes you can substitute people in and out of those systems, and regardless of who they are individually, we're producing the same results, which suggests that there's something more systemic going on. And then finally, let me say this. The equity, the original definition that said nothing about power, said nothing about equity, and said nothing about community engagement. And we tried to repair all three of those in the new definition, where we have been explicit that you've got to deal with power, you've got to deal with equity, and you've got to engage the broad spectrum of the community if you're going to find sustainable solutions. So we've taken a real major step, and I'd make one other quick comment that I want to make explicit. Two of the two original authors were part of this team on the 10-year. And I want to acknowledge John Kanya and Mark Kramer, because they have been more than gracious. They have been great learners and partners and are willing to accept critique. And I've been one who heaped a lot on the original. They accepted the critique, and rather than going inside their shells, they came out to work with folks to figure out how we do the things better and respond to the critique. So I want to acknowledge and recognize their contribution both to the original and to the reframed definition and approach to collective impact.
Wow. One of the things that I have been so inspired by, just in sort of the unpacking of this definition and how we've got there, is two things. One, Junious, in acknowledging the original, the authors of the original collective impact paper, John Kanya and Mark Kramer, you know, you're really kind of holding up that they're modeling what you've asked for in this new definition around the emphasis on learning. And it's really kind of underscored for me that this is very much a practice. It isn't just a static framework, right? Because what I see in this new definition is this real clarity about it's not just the what we're doing, but the how we're doing it and what we're focusing on that matters the most. And that's where I see this richness being added to the framework. So that's part of the reason I think I've been so excited about it. The other thing that for me struck me, and I was really thrilled to see you both kind of mapping it out in this article, was it isn't just about we've got this new definition and here is how we got there. I loved that you actually included in the article some real thought and practical direction and specific strategies for people, for how do you do this then? Like if I'm like, yay, great upgrade of this definition, this is very timely, this is what we need. The question that follows is, so now what? Now what am I supposed to do in this work? And so I'm hoping that as we go through, you can walk us up through these 5 strategies and tell us a bit more about what's baked in there around how we explicitly advance equity in the design, but also the implementation of collective impact. I'm not sure which one of you, like whichever one of you wants to lead out. I'm going to say
Junious, go for it.
Yeah.
So let me lead off in terms of, next slide, please. Here, I want to start off with one that the first strategy has to do with grounding the work. And grounding the work, for me, there are 4 sort of sub-elements of this one strategy. And sorry that we pack so much in it. But the 4 elements of kind of grounding the work is, the first, that you got to create shared definitions and language. And we are especially behind in America in having the conversation. And especially right now, it's in some places even forbidden to kind of talk about some of the historical context that would lead us there. But nevertheless, you got to have shared definitions. There are a bunch of terms here that, if you don't guard against confusion there, you can exacerbate the situation. People need to understand a common definition for equity. Even if we're going to argue about it, we've at least grounded the conversation where we know what we're arguing about. Having a shared language, and it's not only equity, it's race, it's ethnicity, it's gender, it's sexual orientation. It's all of the sort of intersectional sort of characteristics that you really need to help people understand what those things mean, so that we can have these difficult conversations. They're hard enough in and of themselves. They're impossible if you don't have some common shared language. So that's one of the grounding. The second element of grounding is that you gotta ground stuff in data to understand who is benefiting and who's being disadvantaged by the way that we're operating stuff is a data-driven proposition. In part, it's administrative data sets, although we do a lousy job in America on keeping data on anything except deficit measures, and we need to get better at all of this asset stuff we've talked about for 30 years. Hardly a single administrative data set currently collects asset-based data on our communities. And so it creates a pathology around the communities that many people have commented on. But getting the data right, and let me really quickly say the other element of data, it just ain't the administrative data set. Since we don't collect the right data, we can't rely exclusively on administrative data sets. So focus groups, other qualitative data methods, talking to people, seeing what research the community has already done about itself and its condition. There are a lot of sources of data. And as I mentioned before, it's not up just to the analysts to analyze the data and interpret it, because that's where context comes in. That the historical and contemporary context of the people who are experiencing disparities is absolutely essential to being able to accurately interpret the data, because they know the social context in which things were happening to produce those data. This is a problem right now in America because we can't deal with our history. We've got a movement going on that's worse than the 50s and the communist scare and all that. We're basically saying that folks cannot talk about historical facts anymore because they make some people uncomfortable, which is really ironic. We don't give a shit about the people who we visited misery and injury on. We're only wanting to stay comfortable, to have these sort of secondhand conversations. Anyway, that context is important. You're not going to get to solutions unless you understand the dynamics of what produced those disparities. That's engagement with people from those communities who have experienced that. It's listening and adapting that in. And then finally, and I've already made this point, you got to target solutions. We go through all of these exercises, only get to the bottom line, and we have this ethos in America that's really not accurate, that everything has always been equally distributed and shared, and if you talk about targeting to favor a particular group, that's somehow problematic. That is the history of America. I laugh right now at the Supreme Court conversation we're having in America, because the white male has been silent for 230 some years, right? White was silent, and now we've made kind of black woman, black female explicit, and people have gone crazy around it when that has been the norm in this society forever. So you got to be able to target to cure the problems that we produce for various groups. You got to target. So a lot in that first one, but you've got to kind of ground the work. And one last point, you can't jump into this without planning. This ain't really step one. This is step one of the macro strategies. The real step one is getting your leadership team and your community together and start having the conversation of let's get ourselves prepared and ready to address equity. And that might take some personal journey. It might take some collective journey. It might take some other folks coming in to help counsel you, but you got to deal with the big ticket items. For example, are you willing to target? If you ain't willing to target interventions, you really need to come to grips with how effective are you going to be in correcting any problem of disparity if you're going to ignore where the disparity exists. Because what we know from our experience is if you ignore it, you're likely to exacerbate disparities. You are not going to accidentally reduce disparities. The likelihood is that you will exacerbate them if you're not purposeful, planned, and focused on doing this. So that's the first of the 5 strategies. Jen?
Junious, always a tough act to follow. But I will take strategy 2. Thank you for that, Junious. Lots of shout outs in the chat as well. I couldn't agree more. So the second strategy we talk about is focus on systems change in addition to programs and services. And of course, this is systems change and programs and services towards greater equity in all of the dimensions that Junious has begun to illustrate. The framework that we use in the paper is one that folks might be familiar with. It's an upside down triangle by some of the same co-authors as this article from a paper called The Water of System Change. And they talk about 3 levels of systems change that we want folks to be thinking about. So there's the structural level, which includes shifting policies, resources, and practices. So often this is more visible and, as we call it, structural type of work. And this would be some of the mutually reinforcing activities and collective impact jargon that the group might be taking on. The middle is shifting relationships and building stronger connections and shifting power, which we'll talk about also in strategy 3. And then finally, at the bottom of that triangle, we talk about shifting mental models and culture and narrative. And that is that bottom level called transformational systems change. And the idea is that we have to be working at all 3 of those levels. We could say a lot more about that. In the interest of time, I'll point you to the article to learn more, because I also want to say that, yes, we have to be focused on changing inequitable systems, and a lot of that takes time. It takes, the time horizons are long, and people are experiencing pain today. And we need to improve programs and services that can provide immediate benefit, immediate relief today, while we are also in parallel talking about systems change. So I'll stop there with strategy 2, but this is a lot about like what kind of work the collaborative will be taking on. And Junious, feel free to add or take us to strategy 3.
Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead because I want to save as much time as we can. Strategy 3, and I frame it a little bit different because I'm saying shift and share power, right? Because the shifting makes me a little cautious because we're pendulum swinging too much. We've got to find that equilibrium space, and that equilibrium around shifting and sharing power happens when we figure out how to effectively share it, which is some shifting because the people who've historically had it need to give up some. But I don't think it's just them giving up all of the power. It's figuring out how to effectively share power, because I want them big brokers in the room that have all of them dollars and stuff. I just want them to listen to the wisdom of some other stakeholders in terms of how we use those resources. So shifting and sharing power is important. It is it's part of creating and co-creating a new culture for these tables. And that's something that I would emphasize to folks. If you're at the early stages of collaborative, you got a blank slate, right? You got a blank slate to begin creating the kind of cultural norms and practices and approaches, because you got a blank slate. I would really encourage people, don't miss that opportunity. Or even if you're in a pause and a reset where people are open to that, it gives you the opportunity to say, we're going to do something fundamentally different. Let me make a couple of other points really quickly. Inclusion and diversity are not the same as sharing power. Simply bringing some people to the table who are from marginalized group, that doesn't shift anything in the power. You need to talk about what critical decisions are being made, by whom, and how representative of that is that of the stakeholder groups that represent our community. And my final point is, a lot of times we sort of assume that we can make this shift kind of just normally and naturally. No, all of us need some new training, and it just ain't the residents or the people with lived experience. They need a certain type of training to get confidence about being in the room with some of us who are really difficult to deal with in our bureaucratic dominant behaviors. So the training needs to be, how do I, as a person who's traditionally had power and influence, step back and share that with other people and help me to learn how to do that? And for people who haven't had access to power, how is it that you support them in really exercising that power and getting comfortable with it? So there's a big training agenda here. So there's structure, there's practice, there's training, there's rebuilding and co-creating a culture that's going to be sustainable. That's what's involved in the power shift. Just declaring it is not going to be sufficient. Back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Junious. So strategy 4, moving along, listen to and act with community. So as we shared in the crosswalking the old to the new definition, we are really leading with community at the center, and community members and residents at the center of that definition. And how that happens kind of shows up in the shift power strategy, but also in strategy 4 around listen to and act with community. It really builds on what Junious was just talking about. And this is not only listen to, that's important, but when we say act with, I like to use some terminology I learned from my colleague Paul Schmitz, who really brings a lot of asset-based community development expertise into this. And we want to really think about community members and residents, not only as consumers or informers of outcomes, but as producers of outcomes as well. Community is co-owning this work and co-creating results in the Collective Impact Collaborative. One tool I know the folks at Tamarack often point to as well is the spectrum of community engagement. Some of you may have that visual in your head where you are moving on a left-hand side of a spectrum from inform to consult to involve to collaborate to empower. And so that's a really helpful framework in thinking about shifting toward greater action and ownership with community in this work. So I would point you to that for more. And again, I know folks at Tamarack do a lot of work around community engagement and a really asset-based community ownership orientation. Junious, why don't you do number 5? I see good questions coming in the chat that we'll want to get to.
Alrighty. And then if you'll advance for the last strategy there, Connor. The last strategy is building equity, leadership, and accountability for results. And let me really quickly say this. We are not rewarding people who are demonstrating leadership around equity, right? And it's common to the same thing that I saw a generation ago with community policing. It didn't work because we didn't reward people who were good. It was still the tactical unit. It was still the drug unit that we drew leadership. People who did a good job at community engagement got no reward, no perks, no nothing. We're doing the same thing with respect to equity. People who do good at equity should be elevated to the top leadership. They should be compensated for that. They should be rewarded in promotions. We're not doing that. Nor are we detecting when people have failures in their leadership to either get them remediated and improved or find the right people, because ain't everybody equipped to do equity work, right? Just like everybody ain't equipped to work with kids and to do certain jobs. We need to start making some of those differentiations that we're willing to work and improve your skill set, but not everybody, it may ultimately be suitable for this kind of work. The other part of it is we're struggling with shared accountability. And part of that, I think, goes back to the last. You've got to build a culture around that, right? And people have to feel connected to one another in the work in a way that ultimately say, if it all implodes, it's my fault. If it all skyrockets and we're successful, it's my fault. Whatever happens with this, it's my success and my fault in the collective in which I operate. And in very few settings have we gotten to that, because I don't think we framed the learning agenda, the continuous improvement, the other elements in a way that has permitted us to get to that place where we're comfortable saying, Sylvia, I know you tried your best on it, but we didn't achieve the goal. What can I do to help in the next round of this so that we're sure we accomplish the improvement that we all want to do? And until we establish that sort of collective identity and camaraderie, it's going to be hard to get to accountability, and that collective accountability that we rise and fall, we win, we lose together.
Thank you, Junious. I wanted to just address a question that I see in the Q&A box about these 5 strategies. And someone asks, are they a replacement for the original 5 CI criteria for success? And I think you're referring to what we call the 5 conditions, which are common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, backbone, and communication, which are still very relevant. And so these are not a replacement. What I like to think of these as strategies that cut across how you do those 5 conditions. Right. So if you think about common agenda, all 5 of these are relevant to how you set the common agenda, what activities are prioritized in that common agenda, who is setting the common agenda, who is accountable, and how are they held accountable for progress on the common agenda. So you could almost imagine them as kind of cutting across all 5 of those conditions. We toyed around with saying, should equity be a 6th condition, but that made it feel like an add-on and something you could opt into or opt out of, but rather we want to emphasize this is how you do the work that cuts across those 5.
This has just been so rich, and I'm watching both the comments and the questions showing up. So clearly it's landing well with so many of us. And so before we move into sort of tackling those questions, and this is also a call out to you, if you have a question and you haven't yet put it into the Q&A box, please do. Final question. We're looking at the 10-year anniversary, thinking ahead maybe to the 20th anniversary of Collective Impact. What do you see as opportunities and or areas for further attention in order to strengthen that impact of collective impact? Like for me, one of the things I heard very clearly is the need for courage, because it's hard to come together after, generations and generations of distance. And it takes brave people to, want to learn more, chart a new path. So for me, it's like, how do we find that courage? That would be one. But are there others? And what do you see? What do we need to be able to really embrace this new definition?
I'm happy to share a few. And I think the list could be very long, but a couple that come to mind for me, Sylvia, would be, first, I think when we think about this work, when we think about systems change, it's pretty natural to think about how the top of that pyramid. How are we going to, it's not easy, but that's where I think people's minds are. I'm like, oh, how are we going to focus on changing policies or shifting resources? And I hope that we can have more attention to how we go down to the bottom of that pyramid around changing culture and narrative and mental models that are contributing to holding those problems in place. And unless those are changed or unlocked, it's going to be hard to achieve those changes that you want at the top of that triangle around policies and practices. And so it's all interrelated. And so that's one thing, is I think under more focus and understanding how to impact the deeper held cultural norms and assumptions and mental models. I think another maybe more, I'll use the word tactical for lack of a better word, the more tactical piece is addressing sustainability challenges that collective impact efforts are experiencing. And that's both financial sustainability, at least in the States, a lot of efforts are philanthropically funded, and that's really hard to sustain sufficient support for the collaborative infrastructure over the short to medium to long term. So how can we get more public dollar support into the infrastructure of supporting this work, let alone the work itself that's happening in community? So I think there's a financial piece. And then there's also sustaining engagement and momentum and commitment of partners to this long-term work over time. So sustainability is something that comes up for me. And then lastly, really quickly, I'll say, I love being in this international setting on this webinar. I want to see more of that. I want to see more learning across countries, across regions and continents. This work is unfolding in really different ways in different contexts. And I know that we can learn a lot from each other, and I, as a sort of an intermediary field builder, would love to see more of that happening.
Anything you want to chime in around this specifically? What would your hope be, Junious, around how collective impact grabs either opportunities or really focuses attention to strengthen impact?
Yeah, and a little bit irrational, but I don't think we're doing a couple things. One, I don't think we're demanding enough. That there's this gentility around doing the collective impact work, as contrasted when I see people are doing movement building or organizing. There's an edge to that we don't have, and I think oftentimes that's perceived as weakness. And I think it's often among us thinking that we don't have sufficient power. And I would just ask us, we need to do the power analysis. Where is our power? If we've got all these people at the table, what's our reticence to try to organize them to wield the power that's at that table? The rational part of mine, I'm just going to say this out. Lessons from the pandemic. I no longer accept we don't have the money. We've got the money to do anything in America we want to do. We spent $6 trillion in a matter of a few months that we created out of the whole cloth because the pandemic, we thought, demanded that response. That's what I want to see around these issues. America can afford anything that we wish to afford, and we can do it with a rapidity that is blinding when we want to. So it puts all of the social change in a context that you just don't want to do it. So let's have the struggle around that. And people in collective impact need to broaden to that structural issue. Kids should have health care, and everybody should have health care in America. Why the are we arguing about that? People should be able to eat, should have quality education, quality health care. The whole list goes on around things that we are compromising on that we shouldn't, which brings me to the broader point I want to make. No matter what the specific issue is that people are trying to impact, if you don't connect it to the broader social context and social movements, I'll use a barnyard term, you're pissing in the wind, right? Because it's going to blow right back into your face around that. We need to really get some grit behind it. We need to tie this stuff of a kid not reading at third grade level is connected to the whole myriad of issues, many of which we discovered during the pandemic, how these things were connected to one another. So my thing is, boy, we need to get some grit and grist behind what we're doing, get in a more demanding thing. If we really believe that what we're doing is critical and solving this problem is part of the puzzle of solving 3 or 4 more, we should always be aware of what those 3 or 4 more are and not get so isolated on our specific problem that that's all that matters and we lose the context, because we're going to lose people to support us, because the pain is interconnected and they know in communities how these things are. So that for me is a big thing. We need to get bold and aggressive and persistent, insistent, consistent in saying, damn it, we got to deal with equity if we're going to survive. I won't speak to anybody else's society, but I know we ain't going to survive in America if we don't get equity right, because we're going to implode and destroy each other, because we've got the additional, in addition to the virus of racism, we got a virus and a mental illness about guns in this society. And that's where the next step is going for some people if we're not able to tame and direct this.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I got to say, and a big shout out to people that are putting stuff in the chat, because I think it's easy to look, because you're speaking so much of the American context, it's easy for us in other countries to think it's not alive and well. But Michael Kerr and others, I see you've added links that really help us to see the data. And this issue is just as relevant here in Canada. It may not be as front and center, and maybe it, based on this conversation, it needs to be, it should be. And COVID really gives us this opportunity to reset in a whole new way. So let's figure out how to do that and do that well. There are some delicious questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Connor, to help us make our way through them.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sylvia. So we have 3 questions. Please, if you have a question, share it with us. We don't have as much time as we'd like to, but that's okay. We'll make sure that all questions get answered. We'll send our questions to our panelists and we'll get the answers to your questions in our follow-up email. But please share them if you have any burning questions. Our first question comes from Sally. And Sally asks, how can we think about what community means if we are working at a provincial/state or federal/national level?
Good question.
I'll share a perspective in Junious. I think folks are really enjoying hearing from you, so I'm going to keep it short for your addition. But certainly you can't get everyone in the room if you're operating at one of those larger geographies. But I don't think that removes the essential nature of bringing the experience and perspectives of community residents, folks with lived experience into the conversations. So that can happen through participation in formal governance structures of a representative set of folk, from bringing perspectives in through focus groups and surveys and being very consistent in feedback to those groups. So it certainly is one step removed, but I would say the idea is ensuring that lived expertise and experience is part of those conversations in whichever way makes sense for the context. Junious, I don't know if you'd want to add to that.
Well, I'd simply add that I would agree with you that part of what has to happen is to apply all the same principles and values at different levels of geography. So if you're at a provincial level, you want a representative sort of infrastructure that's reflective of that sort of geography. But at the same time, I don't know who said it, all politics are local. Well, all social change in some contexts are local. So what's the analogous structure that you want to support people on the local level? And does that statewide or provincial structure operate to support the work at the local that is influenced by what people learn and communicate there? That's a brokerage house for that. Oh, great idea happening over in Saskatchewan. We need to make sure that the people in Ontario know that that becomes part of the function of that broader geographic group to support and cultivate and harvest the ideas that come out of those individual contexts, and not to, and I know that some legislative and policy stuff is at that level, but if you lose a sense of the grassroots community level as being the basic unit of change that you need to be attuned to and supporting, you're not likely to have that big wide scale effect with kind of a provincial shell. It's got to be real.
What's our next question, Connor?
So our next question is from Rotem. And Rotem asks, do you have any examples of how to balance work between providing programs and services in addition to working on systems change? The groups that they support have had a hard time modulating the work and finding energy and resources for both at the same time.
Go ahead, Junious.
I would just say, don't disconnect them. I think that's what I've learned over time, because I started out saying, okay, I gotta, as much as I wanted to do programs and services, that this is about the system and the structural change, and I was artificially separating them. And what I say to people is that good programs and services inform good policy and structure, and good policy and structure inform good programs and services. So when I'm talking with folks around what the immediate program and services are that would meet their needs, right, their immediate needs, it's bifocal. It's both that, but then what do you learn from that? What are you saying to us about what the needs and experience are that we could elevate to policy, right? So that if people see that we're doing programs and services to both relieve pain and injury, but also to learn what the best policy and systems and structural change are, and vice versa. So that's my main thing, is don't separate them. So if I'm working with a group of residents and I'm starting off saying, okay, I know that this whatever has happened in terms of government practice is visited measure. Let's talk about what would relieve that. But let's not end it there. Let's talk about how you got there. What could have prevented this? What could government have done? What could other sectors of the economy to prevent that? And that becomes the raw material for policy and systems change. So just think about those as being intertwined, and you're always doing both. Even if I'm focused on policy and systems now, I'm looking at what are the programs and services, and vice versa.
And I would just say we read up a great example in the article of a program called Expecting Justice. It's not a program, it's a collective impact effort called Expecting Justice in San Francisco, in California, and in the States. And they do a really impressive job of navigating and balancing both. And there's also an interview with their backbone leader, Dr. Malawa, on the Collective Impact Forum podcast series. So some real good concrete example. Yeah. Shout out to the podcast.
And we'll get the links and make sure we share them out. Last question from Elaine. Go ahead, Connor. This is a really great one. So not that they haven't all been, but do you want to read out?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so Elaine kind of starts with some context for their question. In developing a social innovation model for Canadian universities to adopt to support students from poverty, they consistently encounter a refusal to address social class and class inequality and inequity. As well as adding that they're not courageous, we're not courageous, but it's just not on the agendas. Or they are courageous, sorry. Their question is, what should we do to create collective impact at the grassroots level when we can barely survive?
My own take is, collective impact framework or approach may not be the solution to every stage of the problem. My own take is, and it's kind of a cryptic description, but my initial reaction is that if I were in a situation feeling like that, I wouldn't be thinking about collective impact. I'd be thinking about organizing some folks and kicking somebody's ass to do the immediate thing. And I think all of us need to be careful that, you know, these social change approaches are seductive, right? And especially ones that talk about all this sort of cooperation. And there's a place for that, and I know we need to do more from that. But sometimes there's a place for kicking somebody's ass because they've done wrong and they need to be exposed in that way, and you need to get immediate relief. And trying to form a collaborative table, to me, is a wasted effort. I need to make sure I got the right tools. Sometimes it's going to be organizing. Sometimes it's going to be litigating. Sometimes it's going to be administrative complaints. Sometimes it's going to be organizing. Sometimes it's going to be collaboration. Make sure you got the right tool given the problem so that you don't lose your constituency. Because if you're using the wrong tool and people consistently see that, they're not going to come with you if you're not open to saying, oh, right tool this time is a hammer. Last time it was a screwdriver. I'm going with the flow. So
beautiful. I am so mindful of time, and I'm so aware that I would love to continue this conversation or go deeper in so much of we've just scratched the surface of. But I want to thank you both, Junious, Jennifer. You've clearly given us lots to think about, lots of insights about the deepening of our practice of collective impact, and a real challenge, I think, for us to find that courage and keep pushing that agenda for true equity and change. So thank you all so much.